Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Idea Speaker Series. Our regular host, Dan Samoj, is off this week, so I'll be filling in for him. My name is Francis Fung. I'm the co-lead for engagement at IDEA, and I'm also the National Manager for Rehabilitation and Clinical Services at Market Times Canada. Before we begin today's webinar, I want to let you know that we have French interpretation and closed captioning available. And in the Zoom platform, if you point your cursor to the show captions icon at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to toggle through the settings. For those of you who may not be familiar with IDEA, it is a social innovation laboratory focused on helping create stronger and more diverse labor markets that includes persons with disabilities through knowledge to practice. And IDEA is the acronym for Inclusive Design for Employment Access. Before we dive into the webinar, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement relevant to the IDEA National Office in Toronto, where the National Office of the IDEA Social Innovation Lab is situated, and has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work on it. Please note that this acknowledgement is relevant to Toronto. However, since we are gathered for this meeting virtually, we suggest thinking of the communities in your respective locations as well. This monthly webinar speaker series serves as an opportunity to hear the latest about current topics in the work disabilities policy arena and learn about the activities underway within and beyond IDEA. So during the last 20 minutes of this webinar, we'll hold a question and answer period. You can type your questions in the question and answer box at any time throughout the presentation, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Now, let me introduce our speaker today. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Mukta Kulkarni, professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. And most of her research is focused on workplace inclusion on persons with disability. And she has been the Emphasis Chair for Digital Accessibility and Inclusion at IIMB and has served on the National Committee on Special Abilities of the Confederation of Indian Industry. She serves as an honorary advisor for Enable India, which is one of India's largest disability livelihood agencies. Mukta will be joining us today to talk about building inclusive organizations. Very exciting. So welcome, Mukta, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Francis, and for such a wonderful introduction. Well, hello to everybody. What I have done here is I have put together all of the research that I have across about 15 years on disability. Some of it is in India, some of it is in the United States. So it's a mixture today. So let me get started. One of the things I looked at, this is India specific, is what do proactive organizations do toward inclusion of persons with a disability? I was very curious because we've had seminal laws in 1995 and more recently in 2016 that have mandated, for example, quotas, which is like affirmative action. And for example, the government institutions have to take a certain percentage of persons who are self-identifying as persons with a disability into the employment space. So that is going on well. But then I said, what about the private sector that does not have to follow this kind of quota? What are proactive organizations in that space where nobody is mandating anything, doing proactively toward inclusion? So I spoke with 17 very high-level informants, directors, CEOs, and people of that C-level class. I also spoke with 5 different founders or CEOs of livelihoods agencies. These are agencies that employ, they train and employ persons with a disability, and they are very powerful across the country. And this was spread across the country, not in one neighborhood or not in one state of the country. So these are very high profile respondents in this particular qualitative research. And I asked them about what do you do toward inclusion and especially career development of persons with a disability. The common points are the five that I have noted on the slide in here. The first thing that I found was common across these organizations is all of them wanted to signal meritocracy. They said, look, we want to hire people and we want to showcase people, not because we are showcasing diversity. Somebody is a person with a disability. Each one of these persons is very, very good at what they do. And we want to signal meritocracy alongside that inclusion. So they said everybody is equal and everybody is meritocratic. The second common thing across all of these organizations and respondents, they were very careful about the person's first language. Now, you may not find it surprising because the laws come from the North American continent. And sent a signal to everybody that said, look, you cannot call somebody a cripple or a spastic or disabled, which were all kinds of words that were actually used in the past. They said, no, we have to call people by their first name and person's first language. The third common thing that all of these organizations did was periodic sensitization programs. Now, that in itself is not surprising. But what was surprising and what was fantastic, I thought, was they said, look, we don't have to sensitize just people who are not identifying as persons with a disability. We have to also sensitize persons who do identify as persons with a disability. And they said, well, what should this sensitization look like? They said, look, if you identify as a person with a disability, and if people are not recognizing your merit, you have to speak up. You have to showcase what you're capable of. You have to sensitize people that, look, you're not being very good to me. And importantly, the sensitization also told persons with a disability, are you sure you're asking the correct amount of help? Are you asking too much? Are you asking too little? What do you think should be done? So sensitization happened both ways for managers, for co-workers, for subordinates, and also for persons with a disability to tell them, look, maybe you're asking too much, maybe you're asking too little, what should you be asking for, and so on. The next common thing was a lot of focus, enormous focus on assistive technology and accommodation. And this focus happened through periodic audits every 6 months, which I found to be so fantastically amazing. Every 6 months, there are accommodation audits, there are assistive technology audits, and they said, do we have cutting edge material to help everybody? Do we have space that is appropriate? Is the lighting appropriate? Is the sound appropriate? Is everything going on smoothly? For an organization to do it every 6 months across everybody, I thought was a lot of effort, and that I thought was wonderful. The last thing that was common across these organizations was ties with external disability associations, for example, the likes of the livelihood agencies. So a whole bunch of organizations admitted that, look, we may not be the best suited to help everybody. We may not be the best suited to make sure the accommodation audits happen appropriately. We don't know what language is appropriate. Everybody comes from such different backgrounds. So we don't know if we are being sensitive, we are being good. So why don't we tie up with someone outside who happens to be an expert? So a lot of these ties with external disability agencies worked out beautifully. Now, is this slide true of all of India? Absolutely not. We have to remember these are really high profile organizations, relatively successful organizations, and wealthy organizations. But my hope is when we do work like this and we put it out and we talk about this kind of work, other organizations are sensitized to say, maybe we change the way we speak about people. Maybe we should signal meritocracy more. Maybe we include people in a different way, and so on. So that's one part of the study. Now, then I looked at what do successful employees do toward inclusion? Because at all points in time, we cannot expect that only the organization is going to help. We have to do something too. So I looked at what do successful employees do toward inclusion. Now, these are different studies that I have combined for the sake of this slide. The first study was initiatives taken by respondents in India, and there were 58 respondents. I also did another study in the United States, and here we had 40 respondents. The second study in the United States, that's with a dear friend and co author, Professor David Baldridge, and he had phenomenal access. He self identifies as a deafened person himself, and he helped with this study, so I must acknowledge him, the United States study. So put together, I'm going to mix respondents across countries here, but what was the initiative taken by people who considered themselves successful employees and who also self-identified as persons with a disability? The first thing, each one of them played up ability. And they said to play up ability, I have to do something very, very differently. Some of these respondents were very wealthy, some were not. Some worked in excellent organizations with a lot of assistive technology and accommodation. Some of them didn't. So my examples might come across as unusual to you, but this is reality. One of my favorite stories is that of a professor. He worked in a place in India that is not very wealthy. They don't have too much accommodation, but they're good people. They genuinely wanted to help him continue working there as a faculty member. Now, this gentleman has no use of his lower limbs. He sits in a wheelchair and his hands are also not very strong, but he has use of his hands. And I met him and I asked him, how do you conduct your classroom? And he said, you know what? I have a special assistive solution of my own. So he has a cloth scroll. And if I don't make sense, you ask me a question later. I don't know if I'm going to, if this translates in your context. In India, we have cloth scrolls, like a paper scroll, a cloth scroll, which we keep in shops, and you can buy a whole scroll, you can buy a few meters to stitch your clothing or whatever. So this gentleman, this professor, I found it so interesting. He bought a whole white cloth scroll from the shop, thick, thick white cloth. And he used to write out all of his notes on the cloth scroll as if he's writing on a PowerPoint. Hmm? So he wrote that and he used to hang it behind him in the classroom. And he had the whole class prepared. He knew what he was going to say for those 1.5 hours. And as he's sitting in his wheelchair, he used to just pull the cloth scroll down behind him and he taught the class and he was very successful and the students loved him. They thought he was so innovative and he did things so differently. Another professor told me, again a person with a disability, he said, look, I'm in a wheelchair, I can't quite get up, but I can always ask my students to write on the board before class. I can always ask an assistant to write on the board before class. So some of us, for example, who still use the whiteboard or the blackboard, when we're teaching a case, for example, we write as we speak as the case unfolds. He used to just get other people to write it up front, and he taught the class, and it was fantastic. So there were lots of these small solutions that people came up with on their own. And they said, yes, we expect institutions to help us. We expect the law to help us. We have disability commissioners we can complain to if things don't work out. But the burden, the onus is also upon us to do something to showcase that, yes, we are innovative people, we have ability, and we are going to do cloth scrolls and things like that. Now, this was in India. Now, somebody else in the US, now, this particular study that I did with David, all of these people had sudden hearing loss. Now, imagine you're a doctor, you work in the emergency room, you're successful, you've studied so hard, you've got a great career, and you become deafened because of something. This was one of the respondents in our study in the US. And he said, you know what? I have made a little bit of money. I can no longer practice emergency room medicine. I can't do that. But why don't I use the money that I have made? And I will start working on disability associations and helping other people with some kind of tangible help or connections and so on. And he made the pivot. He said, I have enormous ability to help people. I have knowledge. I have the money to help people. Why don't I do that? Yet another person said, look, I have an understanding of disability rights and I cannot practice anymore. Remember, sudden hearing loss. I cannot go to the court anymore. I can't hear very well, but I can use my knowledge of the equal employment opportunity understanding. And maybe I can do a law practice where I don't go to court, but I practice elsewhere. So a lot of these people, whether the onset of disability was sudden or if they had a disabling condition or a functional limitation from the very beginning, each one of these people who identified themselves as being successful and also as persons with a disability worked really hard to play up their ability. They used informal help. They came up with innovative solutions. Some of these solutions were very simple, some were quite complex, but they all tried to play up ability. The second common thing I found across respondents across these two countries that I have conducted studies in was ongoing advocacy. Unbelievable work. They really worked very hard to negate any kind of myth that people might have about their performance, about their ability. They started building a collective. They said, you know what, if I cannot speak up on my own, and if I do speak up on my own, how many times can I speak up? Let me collect similar others and we can together engage in advocacy to showcase to people, look, you're not thinking right. Maybe you have a myth. Maybe you don't understand how we function. So they really did a lot of awareness building, not just for themselves, but for the broader collective. And this positive spiral was just wonderful. Sometimes this advocacy was also done through the help of agencies, the disability agencies within those specific countries, where they said, look, maybe we can't explain really too well. Why don't you come along? We can do a seminar series, we can do a speaker series. It could be an hour, it could be a sensitization workshop, it could happen every 6 months. It depends on the company. But why don't I get external others to help me with the ongoing advocacy so I can negate any kind of silly thought, any kind of a myth that people might hold in their minds? Similarly, the third and final point, a lot of them began a lot of disability networking within and outside the organization. Now, within the company was not so surprising for me because it's very common to have these resource groups, employee resource groups, but a lot of these resource groups were across organizations. Now, this was more common in India. I did not see so much of this in the US, at least in my limited understanding. But within India, for example, we have these special economic zones, which means a lot of organizations are physically located together in that particular economic zone. And a lot of persons with a disability, they said, look, we have all these, especially in Bangalore, which is where I'm from, a lot of these companies are trying to do the right thing. But maybe there are so few persons with a disability within that particular company that it's not really much is happening there. So they started talking to people within the SEZ, within the special economic zone across the organizations, and they all got together and said, look, maybe we are 5 people in one company or 15 people in one company. But if we all work as a special economic zone, we come together, we are now talking hundreds of people who can work together, who can form a disability network, we can help each other. And in doing so, also help our respective organizations. So, one, we had what successful proactive organizations do toward inclusion. And then we had what successful employees do toward inclusion. Now, then I looked, this was India specific. I was very curious. This is an older study, I think, I forget, it's a couple of years old. And I wanted to see, especially in India, we are spending so much effort and so much money on disability sensitization workshops. And I was very curious. I said, look, how effective are these workshops? Do people just go sit there because it's it's a signal that look, I am doing this, so I have to sit through it? Is it a checkbox exercise? Are they effective? How are they effective? So I looked at the most common format, and this was in most of this was in Bangalore, India, but although we had some other states also, the most common format I found was they do a half-day workshop. Now, this workshop can be done by the organization or in association with the external disability livelihoods agencies. And these half-day workshops are actually quite powerful. I sat through some of them myself across organizations because I had access. They're wonderfully done. They talk about the language, they talk about the technology. Both sides are given opportunities to talk to each other, get on the same page. They're wonderful. But I wanted to see, is it a half day thing and people forget about it? Or is there a longer term impact? So again, I went hunting for respondents, 33 respondents in this particular study. And this is what I found about these half day sensitization workshops. The first thing I found was general awareness 100% increased. That was very good news. In fact, I spoke with people and they had a recall of striking things of the workshop, not the full workshop, but they said, I remember one thing. Even after a year and a half or 2 years. So the first point was good news. At least some people could remember overall. And general awareness definitively increased. People knew what kinds of disabilities, people knew what kinds of laws we have in India. All that was wonderful. The second bullet point, the second finding, maybe is not so wonderful. The workshops resonated more so with people who already had some prior experience with disability because they had a family member who had a disability, they had a friend who might have had a disability, And I found that if the workshops were voluntary, you can't mandate people to attend workshops. So these were mostly voluntary. And I found that these voluntary sensitization workshops ended up attracting those employees who had the least need for such sensitization because they already were sensitized to disability inclusion given their own experience. Now that really did make me think, and we can chat about that later. The other thing I found was the workshops did make a difference for sure, but only, and the long term impact was there only when there was a broader culture of inclusion. For example, there were technology audits. For example, the managers enabled people or success stories were shared and so on. Just doing these half day sensitization workshops every 6 months, 8 months, every year, whatever that was not very useful in terms of genuine inclusion, genuine socialization, career progress, and so on, unless there was a broader culture. People were sensitized after the workshop, but not much change. And that's not good enough. The next thing I found was who runs the workshops made a huge difference. Huge. Typically, in the beginning, we had people who are relatively able bodied or who do not have functional limitations run these workshops. Now, good, all good, that's fine. But we went on to find that if someone with a functional limitation, if somebody who self identifies as a person with a disability, if they conducted the workshop, the recipient was much more interested and they really understood what was going on. For example, I remember attending one session. I didn't know about these apps myself. A person who's legally blind, he came to the workshop. He said, I'm going to run this workshop. And he said, how do you think I get dressed in the morning? How do I know that I'm wearing socks that are the same color? And now people were very interested because they had not thought about this. He said, how do I know? And this is before India became completely, at least Bangalore is very UPI driven. We don't use as much cash. We just wave our phone at a QR code and we pay. But before this, when the workshop was running, he said, how do I know what currency note, what bill I'm giving to somebody when I'm buying a cup of tea in the stall in the company? Now people are even more interested. And he went on to show them how he uses different apps that tell him how he's getting dressed in the morning for work, how he understands currency, what kinds of software he uses, and so on. So, who runs the workshops, I found, makes a huge difference. So, sometimes a person with a functional limitation, when they talk about how they navigate the world, how they see the world vis a vis somebody else, makes a very big impact on the listener. The last thing I found in terms of running effective sensitization workshops is the format of the workshop matters a lot. Even if someone with a disability like this person I spoke about shows up and comes and speaks, it's good, it's powerful, but there's something even better that we can do. So, what is this format? The best formats, the most impactful formats are ones where not only someone like this person comes and speaks and does real life demonstration, but also gets the other person to experience what they're experiencing. For example, some of the best sensitization workshops that I've attended, they said, you know what? Why don't sometimes we did like a blindfold or something, and he said, now you navigate. What obstacles do you face? What kinds of software would you want? What kinds of physical, tangible material would you want in this particular office? So when people themselves experienced this, that was by far the strongest. So what we could do going forward, I felt, at least some of the experiments that are happening in companies in India, I do not know of the United States for this particular um, research question, is we're experimenting with a lot of formats. And we're trying to see if sometimes maybe sensitization workshops need not be completely voluntary. Maybe we could like do strong nudges or something so more people show up. And that's the experiment that's going on at this point in time. This is my last slide, although I have some other things to say. Now, this really was an unusual study. This is not so much about a company, it's about the country. My students and I, at the time they were my students, now they're faculty members elsewhere, we did a lot of, we put in a lot of effort to find out how the broader institutions ascribe an identity to a person with a disability. So we looked at the Indian newspapers, what the narrative was from 2001 to 2010. This is the time period between two census counts, which is when disability was counted. And in the 2010 census is where disability was really going to be counted very carefully, the 21 different types of legally recognized disabilities and so on. So we wanted to see how is the overall institutional narrative changing with regard to persons with a disability. We got all the Indian newspapers with national subscription. We then zeroed it down to one particular newspaper that had maximum circulation. Yeah, that's the word, circulation, across the country. And we then filtered articles and came to 3,176 total articles in this time period, non-redundant, unique articles. And we said we're going to read each one of these articles to figure out how the language is changing in the country. Because just one company cannot change anything. A whole special economic zone can't change anything. The whole country has to speak a certain language. So, what language was being spoken and how the language should change and was changing is what we looked at. The first thing we found was the label that was used to ascribe an identity upon this collective was one of welfare recipients. Now, this again might not make much sense to you as a listener, but this is true of my context. We use the government of India, there's a lot of welfare schemes, which means they will, for example, put aside some money and say this money is going to be used for a welfare scheme for scholarship for persons with a disability or things like that. And because these welfare schemes are so many, they're actually quite good. Some of them are really, really robust and wonderful. But because those schemes were being talked of so much, sometimes I wonder if it backfired. Because now you're ascribing an identity here of somebody, not so much who has an agency, but somebody who's a recipient of welfare. That was the maximum number of articles across the time period between the census counts. The second maximum number of articles were portraying this as a collective with human rights. And this particular narrative became increasingly more prevalent towards the end of the study. And today, I think that narrative has taken over the narrative of welfare recipients, collective with human rights. And this is a really good narrative because now we are portraying people as people who have rights in this country. They have a right to be able to go to the bus stop. They should be able to access the railway network, the trains. They should be able to get good education. And a whole bunch of these articles were increasing, which was very good news. A small number of articles portrayed the collective as being very vulnerable. We had articles that spoke of, oh no, they have to be taken care of. Oh no, this particular woman was in trouble. Oh no, this person was sexually molested because she could not do something, she couldn't defend herself. And while those articles were important, they did portray a frame of vulnerability, good, bad, whatever, but that was the frame. And the smallest number of articles, which really worried me, were portraying some groups of people as being naughty, as being miscreants. So, what were these articles? For example, they were portrayed as cheaters, for example, where one of the schemes that used to run, which I think is dying down now, back in the day, we had telephone booths. And I remember this distinctly, even when I was growing up. Specific telephone booths were kept aside so a person with a disability can man that telephone booth, and all kinds of calls and internet and whatever could be done from there. And a lot of times, what was happening was a person without a disability or not much of a disabling condition was occupying them, and that was perceived as cheating. And that was not done. So that was what showed up. And this particular study for me was eye opening because we have got to be careful of not just what happens within the organization, but if the broader discourse is, for example, one of welfare recipients, then for the person in the organization, it might become difficult to say, you know what, I am a person who has great merit. I am able, I have rights. I can, in fact, teach people how to do things differently. So, to me, the institutional ascribing of identities is very, very critical. So, that is what I had to say. But if there are any questions at this point, I'm happy to take them. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mukta, for a very interesting presentation and the perspectives from different countries and the different parts of the world. Yeah, so we have we're going to open up our Q&A session now, and if you're in an audience and you're not familiar with the Zoom platform, the Q&A button should be on the bottom of your screen, and you can click that, and you should be able to type in your answer. So we have a comment already in the question and answer box, and it says that thank you for the great presentation, and the audience is curious about the networks of persons with disabilities within special economic zones, and are there any specific industries and zones where these networks are particularly successful? And if they are, do you have any thoughts on why those networks are particularly successful?
Yes, and that's a really good question. So the special economic zones that at least the ones I have visited, now that you point out, that's a really good question. Most of them are technology companies in Bangalore. They're not manufacturing, they're technology. And in these groups, it's the easiest to hire and do assistive solutions for persons with a disability. So yes, so the answer is the zones where this inclusion is most successful, now that I'm thinking about it, is technology, banking, and those kinds of companies, not manufacturing. Manufacturing is harder because one, there are fewer people in manufacturing zones. Yeah, and to change a manufacturing zone is harder in India. So yeah, so the answer is just given the smaller numbers of people in manufacturing zones and the difficulty in changing and adapting those spaces to become accessible, the answer is the tech zones and the banking zones. Yeah, that's where it will work out more.
I think. So there
Yeah,
are some
yeah,
differences between the industries, likely because of the nature of the business and the
yeah.
resources they may have and so on. Okay, very good. Another question that we have is that when you spoke about the language and how it influenced people's perspective and disabilities, and the questions about whether you have done any outreach to journalism, schools, or other ways to sanitize like journalists about the language they use about disability.
Yes, yes. I have done only a little bit, but my colleagues have done a lot more. So, for example, um, we have something called the Right to Information Act, which means anybody can ask a question of any government official or something. It works beautifully. I think it's called Right to Freedom or something like that in some Western countries. Here it's called Right to Information. So what we have done, my colleagues have done, not so much me, but I have attended them. They do right to information seminars that are completely free of cost. So people like us might go and sit there and teach other people how to do right to information. In that space, I have seen a whole bunch of outreach to journalists and to different newspapers and magazines and so on, where very much the language we have spoken about. Yes, yes. So that is
That
being done. Yeah.
that is wonderful to hear that there is this kind of work that is out in the community and people do genuinely care about these things, and especially is published on the kind of the public channel there. Another comment on from our audience said that we don't often get to learn from someone outside of Canada, so we really appreciate that the learning from you. Um, and a question that comes after that, policy at the government level is often central to discussions here in Canada. But it doesn't always deliver. So are there any recent policy developments in India that you are excited about?
Yeah, well, that is true everywhere. Huh? We speak a lot, and here also we have so many high-powered discussions, but they don't always deliver. I have wanted to do something. I have also failed at the delivery, so that's I think common everywhere. Now, the policy, the one development I'm really excited about is in the education space. And I must say, my goodness, I mean, the way we are unfolding neurodiversity into our classrooms is marvelous. My school, for example, and we are shining star good in the way we help our students, and we are also learning along the way. So when the 2016 Act came out and neurodiversity and every all of that was included, earlier it was only physical disability. So now we have 21 recognized disabilities and more uh, if the doctor says so. Hmm? Now, to include these kinds of students or employees within organization, a lot is being done. Now we have special educators, we have study circles, we have special mentors, we have all kinds of things that I think are just really very helpful in the education space. That uh, is critical, I think. And that I think the country and a lot of activists and a lot of persons with a disability themselves are doing well. Yeah.
I see. Thank you. We have a couple more questions. The next questions that we have is, wondering if you can comment on sort of the makeup and the categories of people with disabilities in the workforce in India, because in Canada, there's often viewed to have several categories of disability and pain actually being one of the most common condition that people report, especially in cases of employment. All the other categories sometimes seem to be underrepresented in certain ways. So wondering about the categorization of people with disabilities in India's workforce.
That's another good question, John. You know what? I don't know, I might be mistaken, but my gut feel after so many years of doing disability work here is pain is not even a thing here. Pain is not a recognized disability. Somebody will say, oh, for example, somebody who works with me, she has a neck injury because she was in a car accident. Nobody is going to even consider that a disability. Okay, you have pain, you go get some injections and you show up. which is so interesting. We do not talk about that as a disability. The biggest representation by far is physical disability, not even neurodiversity. We have just begun that. Physical. So you will have a lot of people who have limb issues, hands and legs. That's the first one. The first thing you'll see is wheelchair access in India. The second one, I think, will be visual, followed by hearing. That is how I think I would think about the different categories here. Pain, interestingly, is not a thing. I don't know why that is.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, so switching gears a bit, earlier in your presentation, you talk about the different portrayal of people with disabilities, and you talk about within the organization there are different workshops being run, and who runs the workshops matters, and there's differences in terms of the success on those workshops. But the question is more about what about like any recent innovations, aside from those workshops that you see at the organizational level, whether it's programs or initiatives that are really helping workplaces become more inclusive.
Hmm. So I'll tell you a very interesting one. I couldn't attend it. I sit on this board, the advisory board I sit on, Enable India. They are working heavily with the government of India. You should look this up. Huh? This is fascinating. They did something called the Purple Economy Festival. This was in Goa, which is in a different state, not this state that I live in. And in this Purple Fest, they had invited government officials, all the big industry people, huge numbers of persons with functional limitations and disabilities. And in this Purple Fest, purple economy is the economy of persons with a disability. That's purple, the color purple in India at least. Hmm? And under this huge umbrella where thousands had gathered, they all got together and said, if we look at disability as an economic driver for the country, how does the narrative change? So they said, for example, let us say I cannot walk hypothetically. If you enable me to walk, what do I need? I need a crutch. Somebody makes a crutch, I pay him. He benefits, I benefit. I can walk, I can go to the bus stop, I can sit in the bus and go to work. When I go to the bus and I pay somebody, the bus driver makes money. The state of Karnataka makes money. I go to work, I pay taxes, the government makes money. And they started this very beautiful line of thought, not at the organization level. So I'm sorry I'm not answering that question, but the biggest innovation right now is this collective ecosystem of how we can do a purpose ecosystem where multiple diverse players can come together and just make a huge difference, not at the level of the individual or the company, but at the level of the economy. Look this up later, Purple Fest. It was done in Goa last year. It was a huge success. Huge. Yeah, yeah.
Purple Fest. We'll take note to that. Thank you. Um, Another question is that Canada is a very multicultural. We're very diverse, and in fact, it's predicted within the next 20 years or so, the 50% of the Canadian population is going to be mixed up by immigrants and the immigrants' children. So intersectionality is quite a hot topic, and it's not just related to different culture, but also religious background and sexual orientation, how people identify themselves. So is there any discussion regarding disability and intersectionality in India?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so there is disability rural versus urban, there's gender, there is a socioeconomic class. I'll tell you one story. I promise to like make it quick. I know we are like going to push time, but it's a really good story of intersectionality. Now, I know this gentleman, let's call him Raghu. That's not his real name, but that's what I call him in the journal article also. I have published about him. I've known him for many years. He came from a small village. He came to Bangalore. Huh? And he told me when he first came to Bangalore, he was very shy. He couldn't speak any English, and he was trying. He spoke only Kannada, which is the native language of this state. And he said, he was very poor. He didn't have good clothes, and his shirt was not very nice. And I remember he used to wear this slipper. What do you call it in slides? I think that's what you call it, slides. Yeah, he was wearing like slide slipper kind of thing, which he was really poor and was all worn out and not nice looking, and used to try to go and get jobs and whatever. He really struggled. He really struggled. Then he met with a disability training agency, livelihoods agency. They helped him a little bit. He got a little bit of money. He started wearing better clothes and whatever. They still wouldn't get any jobs. Very difficult. Fast forward the story to, I don't know, 5, 6 years later. I kept in touch with him. He got a job, and in fact, it's a small job, but he got a job. And in fact, he saved money and he could send it back to his village. And he became quite the hero. And he said, "See, ma'am, I'm so dashing now. Before I was this poor guy with no good clothes. I'm so dashing now." And that really made me think, um, when should we stop telling the story of somebody who's so when I think of intersectionality, if I had stopped following Raghu after 2 years, my story of Raghu would have been, oh, poor guy. Maybe I would have elicited from you pity. Maybe you felt bad for him. But if I complete the story and now I tell you that Raghu is the sole earner who is sending money back to his village, hmm? It's a story of fortitude. It's not a story of misfortune. So when we look at intersectionality, of course, there is a rural poor person, this person with a disability. But over time, that intersectionality can change, and the story of a misfortune can become one of fortitude. So, when does the story stop? Is it a story of intersectionality or something else? And importantly, I have thought, whose story are we telling? Is it a story of Raghu? Or when I tell a story of him, am I telling a story that I want to tell as a researcher? So sometimes I wonder who is shaping the story and whose story are we telling, especially in qualitative research, we have so much power over the story. So we should, as researchers, step back and do a little bit of reflection, I feel, Um, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, quantitative, it doesn't come up, but in qualitative, okay, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to start telling stories. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting that self-identity can evolve and also is changes from the perspective of the observer as well. I'm fascinated about the collectivism that you spoke about in India and the success through that collectivist effort. And when I think about the North American, the more Western culture, sometimes it's a little bit more focused on entrepreneurship, individual performance, and individuals' achievements, things like that. And I think one of our audience is also interested in the experience that you have in India and US, and what would you say would be the major difference between the workplace disability inclusion in those two countries, and or maybe other countries that you're interested about as well?
The biggest one, which now it doesn't surprise me anymore, but the first time it surprised me. I don't know other countries. I know other countries a little bit, but US more so because of data. The biggest difference is in US, the first thing people talk about is the law and accommodation. In India, in conversations with people, the law doesn't come up at all, which I think so fascinating. Nobody says, I'm going to sue you. It just doesn't come in the picture. It's all informal, it's all ad hoc, and it's not really, I mean, the law is there. Of course, it's there. And the newest one is written actually very beautifully, but that doesn't come up in conversation. The word accommodation also doesn't come up as much. And now it has come, of course, we borrow from the US heavily. So, of course, it's come here too. But law and accommodation were not conversation topics here. Law is still not a conversation topic as much when you talk to respondents. It's more about helping each other and informal help and relying on informal networks, like the cloth scroll story, like the professor. I don't know if it would even be allowed in a Western country, or this gentleman professor who got people to write on the board informally. I don't even know if that would be allowed. Here it is applauded. So, yeah, so the ad hoc informal, yeah, work.
Yeah, very interesting. So certainly the legal compliance and sort of the human rights and versus employers' rights sometimes is a bit of a debate in our systems here. I think we're coming close to sort of the end of our time in the webinar, but maybe I can ask you one more question, and then if you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to introduce sort of like the next series that we're going to have in a few weeks. But one of the questions that we have is that you spoke about so many different things, so many different issues that are on the forefront of people that are working in this space. So for organizations that may be just starting with this inclusion journey, this disability inclusion journey, what would you suggest them to prioritize, especially between like small business versus like a large enterprise?
Ah, the first thing I would tell organizations is don't assume, talk to the person. Because sometimes you might want to help, but the fundamental assumption may be wrong. You may give them what you think is helpful, but it may not be helpful. So, whether a big company, small company, I think it would be so helpful. Ask me, hey, what do you want? This is what we have on offer. Does it really help you, or stress you even more? Because I may not even want that assistive technology. I could do something differently. So, I would really leave that with organizations. Please don't assume. Yeah.
Right. The active listening and really getting the perspective from the person that perhaps will require that support is really, really, really crucial. So thank you so much for your time. I think we've learned a lot from you and joining us from from far away as well too. And I also want to just take a moment here to thank our French interpreter, and hopefully for those who needed French interpretation, that's working out for you. Um, and also for the audience, we would like to invite you for our next speakers series, which is going to be on November 29th on the Friday. And the speaker is going to be Sinead McCarthy from Youth Employment Services. So please watch out for that. In the meantime, do reach out to us through our email, info@braie-idea.ca. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, and follow us on the various social media accounts as well. But wonderful to see you here, Mukta, and hopefully we'll connect in some other ways as well. And thanks for everyone for joining us, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Bye bye.